صدقہ کسی نے پیدل چلی ہوں، ارے پیدل چلی ہوں کانٹوں کے میں درمیان، قیدی ہوں میں بابا جان، اے قیدی ہوں میں بابا جان، چلو شام چلتے غیر ریحان و سرور، وہاں دیکھنا کیا ہے چہلم کا منظر، بی بی سکینہ، بی بی سکینہ کرتی ہے اب تک فغان، ہائے قیدی ہوں میں بابا جان، ہائے قیدی ہوں میں بابا جان، اب شاہزادی کہاں، ہائے قیدی ہوں میں بابا جان، صلوات
صلوا علی محمد و آل محمد.
صلوا علی محمد و آل محمد. عجل فرجنا. کربل کی کہانی جب کوئی بھی سنائے گا، دل والوں کے آنکھوں سے ایک دریا بہائے گا، وہ کارواں سرور کا جو شان سے نکلا تھا، صغرا کو خبر کیا تھی، نہ لوٹ کے آئے گا، ٹوٹی ہے کمر شہ کی نہ گھبرانا مگر اکبر، فرزند نبی تیرے لاشے کو اٹھائے گا، سوتے نہ تھے تم اصغر جھولے میں تڑپتے تھے، دنیا کو خبر کیا تھی ایک تیر سلائے گا تھا ہاتھوں کے کٹنے کا کچھ غم نہ دلاور کو سیدانیوں کا پردہ اب کون بچائے گا سرور نے اٹھائی تھی سب ساتھیوں کے لاشیں شبیر تیرا لاشا اب کون اٹھائے گا کربل کی کہانی جب کوئی بھی سنائے گا دل والوں کے آنکھوں سے ایک دریا بہائے گا لعنت اللہ قوم الظالمین وسيعلم الذين ظلموا الكذبون ولينقلبوا انا لله وانا اليه راجعون
رحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله بارئ الخلائق الأجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء حبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد. ثم الصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين لا سيما ولي الله الحجة ابن الحسن صاحب الأمر والزمان. اللهم صل على محمد. روحي وأرواح العالمين له الفداء ولعنة الله على أعدائهم وعلى منكري فضائلهم من الأولين والآخرين إلى قيام يوم الدين. آمين رب العالمين. صلى الله عليك يا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. صلى الله عليك يا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويبا وواب نجاة الأمة يا غريب الغرباء يا مظلوم كربلاء السلام على من جعل الله الشفاء في تربته السلام على من الإجابة تحت قبته السلام على ساكن كربلاء فيا ليتنا ثم يا ليتنا وكنا معكم سادتي يا سادتي فنفوز فوزا عظيما أما بعد قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الحكيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وجعلناهم أئمة يهدون بأمرنا صدق الله العلي العظيم وآمنا به زينوا مجالسكم بذكر محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على As in the previous years, pay tribute to Maulana Imam Ali ibn al-Hussein Zain al-Abidin salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, and to pay tribute to the fact that he spent his entire life in a state of grief, and his grief for what he witnessed in Karbala knew no bounds. To pay tribute to this, inshallah, we shall have Masa'ib twice. Masa'ib and Na'i at the beginning of the majlis, and Masa'ib at the end of the majlis. We will begin this dhikr of Imam Sajjad alayhi salam with a Masa'ib. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The pains of Karbala, the pains of Karbala in the heart of Imam Sajjad. The historians mention for 35 years, or for the 40 years that Imam Zainul Abidin lived after the tragedy of Karbala, there was not a single time that food was presented in front of Imam or water was placed in front of Imam Sajjad, except that he would stare at the food, he would stare at the water, and he would begin to weep and cry until his tears would be mixed with the food and his tears would be mixed with the water. He would look at the food and he would say, how can I eat and how can I drink when my father Hussein was killed in Karbala while he was thirsty? How can I drink this water? And every time I look at it, I am able to hear the cry in my ear, the cry from the children on the day of Ashura. When And the children of Hussein cried out, Al-Atash, Al-Atash. How can I, Sajjad, drink this water? Allah, Allah. On one of the days, Abu Hamza al-Thumali comes to Imam Zainul Abidin and he says to him, Yabna Rasulullah, until when will your grief and until when will your tears continue over the tragedy of Karbala? Yabna Rasulullah, Shahadah and martyrdom for you is an honor. Yabna Rasulullah, after Rasulullah, they killed your grandfather, Amir al-Mu'mineen. They killed your grandmother Fatima al-Zahra. They killed your uncle Hassan and your father Hussein. Shahada for you is a karama and an honor. Why do you weep, Yabna Rasulullah? Imam Sajjad with tears flowing down his face, down his blessed cheeks, looks at Abu Hamza al-Thumali and he says to him, Oh Abu Hamza, if indeed seeking martyrdom is an honor for us, the lineage of Rasulullah, but oh Abu Hamza, then tell me if martyrdom is from our honor, what was the fault of the women of Rasulullah? If you have heard from the family of the Prophet their successors being martyred, have you ever heard in history that their women were taken as prisoners from city to city? Oh Abu Hamza, tell me which family of which prophet were their tents burnt down on them? Imam Sajjad says, every time I looked at my aunties or I looked at the women from the family of Bani Hashim, I would remember how they fled from one burning tent to another burning tent in Shahadah. Ya Shiat Ali Mohamed, let me recount for you one of the tragedies of Shahadah. As the tents were lit on fire and the women were running from one burning tent to another burning tent. Burning tents, the heat of the fire that can burn the skin, that can burn the people alive. And then there is the black smoke with which you are choking and you are not able to breathe. And from that they run into the deserts, and with the desert the sand is blowing into your face, the sand is blowing into your eyes. From all this fear you run into the Maidan. On one hand you see the decapitated bodies of Abu Abdullah and the rest of the Shahadah. You turn towards the other side, you have the marauding horsemen surrounding you, laughing at you, hitting you, whipping you, waiting to rob you of your belongings. At this moment, one of the daughters of Imam al-Hussein, Sayyidah Ruqayya, she comes out running from the burning tent. Darawi says that the dress of Sayyidah Ruqayya was on fire, but the little girl, out of fear, was not able to pay attention to the fire on her dress, so she kept running into the desert until one of the horsemen by the name of Khuli al-La'in, he got a hold of this young girl. Allah, Allah, ya Shia. He slapped her across the cheek. 4-year-old daughter Sayyidah Ruqayya fell down to the floor. She fell down on the sands of Karbala, tears rolling down her cheek. One of the ulama say, when you go to the Arab of Sayyidah Ruqayya, know that this 4-year-old daughter was buried with a face that was swollen due to the slaps. It says they slapped her on the cheek and then they picked her up. They showed the earrings on the ears of Sayyidah Ruqayya. La'natullah ala khuli. He ripped out the earrings. Sayyida Ruqayya looks towards the Maidan and she says, oh my father, who is there to nurse? Who is there to nurse my earlobes that have been ripped apart? Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. أحبائي, the grief of Karbala remains eternal in the hearts of the mu'mineen. فأنتم أيها الشيعة, when you listen to what happened to the daughters of Ali Muhammad, the likes of Sayyida Ruqayya, the likes of Sayyida Khawla, the likes of Sayyida Safiya, our tears flow. And it is as if your heart wants to come out of the body. And this is mujarrad on us listening. For what about Imam Sajjad Husu? Sometime back, one of the mu'mineen was telling me, he was blessed with a daughter. He says, Sheikh, my daughter, sometimes she's mischievous. He says, and when I want to scold my daughter, he says, I just want to raise my voice towards my daughter. He says, I look into her eyes and I see the innocence. He says, I feel bad, I can't even scold her. And what type of people, Mabani Umayyah, leave scolding, they slapped his daughter. And it is the likes of Sayyida Khawla and Sayyida Ruqayya. When they were slapped, they would look at the men, they would say, we are yatimas, we are orphans, have mercy on us. This is the grief Imam Sajjad alayhi salam lived with. And this is the grief that the Shias of Ali Muhammad live with. Antum ahibai, as you get closer, for those of you who have the tawfiq to go to Karbala, and may Allah grant each and every one of us the opportunity to go to Karbala. Those of us who are not going to Karbala, our hearts inshallah are traveling to Karbala. But in these nights between now and the Arba'een, keep this grief of Ali Muhammad with you, because these are the nights where they are close to approaching the city of Sham. And that entry into Sham, for which Imam al-Hujjah in Ziyarat al-Nahiya says, فَلَا أَنْدُبَنَّكَ صَبَاحًا وَمَسَاءً. I shall weep for you every morning and every night. وَلَأَبْكِيَنَّ عَلَيْكَ بَدَلَ الدُّمُوعِ دَمًا. I shall weep for you instead of tears. I shall weep blood for you. Ya Mawlana, Ya Sahib al-Amr. For this is the grief that Imam Sajjad alayhi salam lived with for the 35 according to some riwayat, and 40 years according to other riwayat. He lived for 35 to 40 years after the tragedy of Karbala. And in order for us to understand the contribution and the magnitude of the contribution of Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, it is vital for us to pay attention to the environment and the circumstances under which Imam Sajjad Ruhillahul Fida fulfilled and executed the function or the role of this divine post of Imam. For indeed, the magnitude of the function is understood by analyzing and appreciating the circumstances under which that function is executed. The circumstances in which Imam Sajjad alayhi salam lived were perhaps one of the darkest ages of Islamic history and one of the most difficult stages in which tashayyu' has gone through. For you have over here a regime that has not held back in any crime when it came to ending the dhikr of Imam al-Hussein and ending the dhikr of Ali Muhammad. They did not hold back on any perceivable crime except that they performed it on the day of Ashura. From the brutality in which they killed the Imam al-Hussein to the brutality in which they took the women as prisoners from city to city. For how you have the entire light, 17 shining lights, 18 shining lights from the house of Bani Hashim that have been eradicated. Companions, the Shias of Ali Muhammad, 72 unparalleled ones eliminated from the face of this earth. And you have Imam Sajjad come back to the city of Medina. And Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam himself voices his loneliness in terms of lack of supporters and lack of Shia, such that Imam Sajjad alayhi salam himself is narrated to have said, ما بمكة والمدينة 20 رجلا يحبنا أهل البيت. In the entire Mecca and Medina, in the entire Hijaz, there are not 20 men that we can find who love us Ahlul Bayt. He didn't say Shia. He didn't say Muwali. He didn't say followers. He said 20 people, mujarrad 20 people who love us. And his sympathizers. You can count 20 people in the entire Hijaz who have love for Imam Sajjad. He says we couldn't find 20 people. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam comes to execute the role of imamat and perform the role of imamat in this sort of environment, surrounded by enemies in the entire Hijaz. When you want to understand the value of somebody's contributions, then it is imperative, it is necessary that you evaluate the circumstances under which the person gives a contribution. Imam Sajjad, number one, in this environment functioned. Not 20 people in the entire Hijaz who have love for Ahlul Bayt. He goes to Masjid al-Nabawi, faced by people who have hatred towards him, faced by people who don't want to exhibit sympathy towards him. Imam Sajjad went for Hajj. Haters from Quraysh surround him. And this is this life which Imam Sajjad alayhi salam entered into upon Karbala, or the tragedy of Karbala. Number two, you find that it was during this period that these so-called Islamic conquests were continuing. Conquests that started under the leaders from the Madrasa of Saqifa, leading on to the time of Muawiyah al-La'in, and after him the rulers of Bani Umayyah. They continued these quests for territorial expansion under the name of Islam. And these are the people from the Madrasa of Saqifa and following in their footsteps Bani Umayyah. For to condemn Bani Umayyah without condemning the people of Saqifa in itself is a form of hypocrisy. In fact, it is hypocrisy at its highest level, because Bani Umayyah did nothing but build on what Saqifa presented them. And Ziyarat Ashura points towards this reality. Allahumma la'an awwala dhalimin dhalama haqqa Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa akhira tabi'in wala dhalik. The first ones, alladhi assasad asasad dhulm, those who established the foundations of dhulm for Ali Muhammad. And then the later people who came and capitalized on these. The ones who capitalized were the likes of Bani Umayyah. But this expansionist mentality of conquering territory and conquering land in the name of Islam was started by the Khulafa of Saqifa and capitalized upon by Bani Umayyah. And it was during even At-Tabari in his Tariq states that one of the first battalions that was sent, or contingencies of the Muslim army, according to them, the Muslim army, one of the first contingencies that was sent to go and invade the shores of Spain happened during the time of Uthman ibn Affan. And it was during this time that these expansionist mercenaries were sent towards North Africa, and they reached the shores of Libya, where forceful conversion of people to Islam was conducted. Forceful conversion, where the Quran says, La ikraha fi din, and servitude of men by usurpation of their wealth and their property under the title of zakat, and slavery of men in the name of Islam. And a lot of these slaves that were acquired, whether they were prisoners of war or whether they were men just captured and kidnapped from their houses and brought back to the Islamic capital, Medina, you find that a lot of these slaves from these conquests were brought into the city of Medina, even during the time of Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. And the manner in which these slaves were treated, there is an entire treatise from Muawiyah, because this expansionist conquests were happening even during the time of Muawiyah. And we understand that there was a level of collaboration between the Roman Empire and the madrasa of the madrasa of Saqifa. There was collaboration between both of them, and this collaboration took a new turn with the coming of Muawiyah and Yazid. And they orchestrated these conquests. They orchestrated them in conjunction. You look, one of the greatest advisors of Yazid, Al-La'in, was a person by the name of Sir John. Sir John was a Roman ambassador functioning from Syria, the closest advisor to the so-called Muslim leader, was the ambassador of the Roman Empire based in Sham. There are historical texts that have been preserved, letters that have been preserved, where even during the time of Muawiyah, directions were given as to how slaves captured from these Muslim conquests should be treated. And I want to quote for you a passage from Kitab Sulaim bin Qais al-Hilali. This is a letter from Muawiyah to Ziyad bin Abih. Yani from Muawiyah to who? The father of Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad. A letter that stipulates how the slaves should be treated. Now this is a letter from Muawiyah, who has assumed the position of Khalif, to Ziyad ibn Abi, who is one of his governors, which means that this is an official government document. This, in essence, forms part of legislation. It was part of the constitution. Just look at the constitution and the legislation of the Islam of Bani Umayyah and the Islam of Saqifa. And you begin to understand why the world has a negative image from that time about Islam. And then you come and you see the contributions that Imam Sajjad alayhi salam made. This letter of Muawiyah to Ziyad ibn Abi, the father of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, he says to him, انظر إلى الموالي ومن أسلم من العجائب شكرا. He says, look into the affairs of the slaves. ومن أسلم من العجائب. من الأعاجم, عفوا, not عجائب, من الأعاجم. أعاجم plural of عجم. Ajam yani non-Arabs. Look into the affairs of the slaves and the non-Arabs. Tayyib, at that time, who was the non-Arabs? Non-Arabs, yani the slaves that have been forcefully brought into Islam from outside of Hijaz, which included parts of the Byzantine Empire and from North Africa. وَخُذْهُمْ بِسُنَّةِ عُمَرٍ. Treat them and deal with them as per the sunnah of Umar. Look at what he says. فَإِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ خَزِيِّهِمْ وَذُلِّهِمْ. For indeed, in his sunnah, there is suppression and there is oppression of these slaves. This is a governmental level document passed from the highest level head of state to the governor. And it becomes legislation. This became legislation under Islam. Suppress, oppress, humiliate the non-Arabs. This became part of government process, government legislation. He goes on to say, from this humiliation and this oppression, وَأَن تُنْكِحُ الْعَرَبْ فِيهِمْ وَهُمْ لَا يُنْكِحُونَنَا. You can marry their women, but do not let their sons marry your women. وَتُكَثِّرْ بِهِمْ فِي أَعْطَائِهِمْ وَأَرْزَاقِهِمْ. Suppress them in their salaries and suppress them in the public funds that they are supposed to receive from the Baytul Mal. We all see in our own times when a dictator wants to suppress the citizens of the state, what is the first thing he does? He makes them economically disabled. Paralyze them economically. Don't give them work. If they give them work, limit their ability to earn in that work. Suppress them so that they never rise from that poverty level. High al-fikr of dictators and what we see in history and in contemporary history. This came from where? This came from Bani Umayyah and from Madrasa of Saqifa. وَأَن تُقَدِّمُوهُمْ فِي الْمَغَازِي. When you go for war, don't use our people in the front lines. Use these slaves and these non-Arabs as the frontline soldiers. Why? If there are casualties, it is them who get killed, not us. We're the elite. شايفين? See, in today's wars, what happens? Look at these world organizations and the coalitions that they form when it comes in their wars. And look at some of the nationalities that form part of these global coalitions. When they go into war, go and look at the first casualties are from which nationalities? Nationalities that belong to countries who are third world countries and require international aid. So in order to win the international aid, what do? They come, they put forward their citizens who go and they become killed in the front lines. And those who feel that they are elite, their lives are protected. This siyasa, this politics come from where? It comes from the madrasa of Bani Umayyah and the madrasa of Saqifa. ولا يؤم أي واحد منهم في الصلاة. The slave is a non-Arab, even if he recited the Shahadatain. They should not be allowed to lead Salatul Jama'ah. This is the Islam that is being preached through territorial conquests. You blame those people for revolting against the so-called Islam of the day. You blame people at that age for waging war against Islam or for becoming apostates when this is the Islamic treatment that they were subject to. This was under the name of Islam. People recognized the Islam of Rasulullah through these actions. They formed their perceptions that this is Rasulullah based on hadith like this. Based on behaviors like this. History don't lie. ولا يؤم أي واحد منهم في الصلاة ولا يتقدم أحد منهم في صف الأول إذا حضرت العرب. You have a non-Arab and you have a slave. None of them are allowed to stand in the first line of Salat in Salatul Jama'ah if there are Arabs as well. The Quraysh and the Arabs, they get to stand in the first line of Salatul Jama'ah. Enter, you're a slave, you're from a non-Arab country, stand in the back. Now we begin to understand why in the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein we say, Ashhadu annaka kad akamta salat. It wasn't about praying. It wasn't about people waking up for Fajr or praying Dhuhr and Asr and Maghrib and Isha. It was about protecting the ruh of Salat, the essence of what Salatul Jama'ah stands for. The Salatul Jama'ah that signifies everybody under the Shahadatain, at the minimum Shahadatain, and the third Shahadah for Iman. But at the minimum under the Shahadatain, Salatul Jama'ah means what? That there is no difference between man when it comes to when it comes to ethnicity or wealth, because they are together in their wilayah for Allah and the Rasul. And for a mu'min, the wilayah of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Innama akramakum indallahi atqakum. Now you understand the value of what Imam al-Hussein did on the day of Ashura, when he put his cheek on the cheek of Joan. Joan was a slave in the household of Abu Dhar. Joan was a student of Abu Dhar. This title slave just became a reason for Abu Dhar to give tarbiyah and raise a person who comes out from the madrasa of Abu Dhar like Joan. Humanity says to them, Bi abi anta wa ummi. John was from Abyssinia, but Imam al-Hussein treated him the same way that he treated Ali al-Akbar. He put his cheek on the cheek of John, and he put his cheek on the cheek of Ali al-Akbar. This is Imam al-Hussein. This is the Islam of Bani Umayyah. And the list goes on and on. Whoever wants to review this can review Kitab Sulaym bin Kaysar al-Ali. This is how the people were treated inside of Medina and inside of Hijaz. In this environment, the historians narrate, and if you refer back to A'yan al-Shia, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam would go to the square in Medina and would go and purchase these slaves and bring them into his house. Now a person might come and say, does this mean that Imam Sajjad actually promoted and encouraged slave trade? Before you jump to that conclusion, if you understand how these non-Arabs and slaves were treated by Bani Umayyah, come and see what Imam Sajjad did and look at the plan of Imam Sajjad. The narrations mention, historians mention, Imam Sajjad would bring these slaves into his house. They would eat food that is better than what Imam Sajjad ate for himself. Lived in a state of comfort, more comfortable than what Imam Sajjad provided for himself. Gave them respect, gave them dignity, gave them a tarbiyah of Islam, gave them tarbiyah as per the teachings of Rasulullah, and within the end of the year, Imam Sajjad would then liberate them, send them back to their home countries with enough money or capital to live an independent, dignified life. Every year for 40 years, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam purchased 1,000 slaves, sheltered them under his roof, gave them tarbiyah for the true teachings of Rasulullah and Amir al-Mu'mineen, and after a year liberated them to go back to their own hometowns and live a life of karamah. Do you know what in essence he did? Imam Sajjad alayhi salam nourished and gave tarbiyah to ambassadors of Shiaism who would go back to their hometowns and tell their people, this is the Islam of Ali Muhammad, as opposed to the Islam of Bani Umayyah. They went back to their hometowns and became ambassadors of Tashayyuh. When they lived with Imam Sajjad for a period of a year, and they saw Imam Sajjad every time food was brought in front of him and he wept for Imam al-Hussein, and they would ask him why, he would narrate to them how Imam al-Hussein was killed. These people went back to their hometowns and took the story and the tragedy of Karbala back to their hometowns. Imam Sajjad, under the very nose of Bani Umayyah, give tarbiyah to a generation that would uphold the name of Imam al-Hussein, which they tried to kill and eliminate from the face of the earth. Islam in India, Islam in the shores of North Africa from Libya onwards. To a great extent, if you trace it back to its roots go back to these so-called slaves that Imam Sajjad alayhi salam raised and gave tarbiyah. These are people who graduated from the school of Imam Sajjad, who went back and preached real Islam. Otherwise, what was remaining from Islam when you look at these documents of Muawiyah and the likes of Muawiyah? Aywa. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Imam Sajjad nourished and gave tarbiyah to 1,000 men year upon year, nourished them to be the Shias of Ali Muhammad and to spread the message of Amir al-Mu'mineen in different parts of the world using this avenue. First contribution. Number two, Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam played a foundational role in ensuring that the azar and the oppression of Imam al-Hussein, the madlumiyat of Imam al-Hussein would remain alive. In other words, Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam established the fundamentals of azar and the commemoration, the weeping of Imam al-Hussein under the very eyes of Bani Umayyah. See, Bani Umayyah were out to eliminate the liquor of Ali Muhammad. They were out there to eliminate any trace of Ali Muhammad. وخاصة Imam al-Hussein. Think about what they did on the day of Ashura, the Asr of Ashura. And subhanAllah's majlis of Imam Sajjad is such that there are tears in every part of this majlis. That we contemplate, if we were to contemplate, what did they do Yawm Ashura? They trampled on the body of Imam al-Hussein. Umar ibn Sa'ad said, bring me 10 horsemen that have not been used in war, so that we can trample on the chest of Abu Abdullah, on the chest of Hussein alayhi salam. They trampled on the chest of Sayyid al-Shahadah. Then what did they do? Umar ibn Sa'ad said, whatever is remaining from the body, turn it on the chest so that we can trample the back. The other day, I was thinking about this hadith. To trample on the chest and to trample on the back. What remains from a body? And if you were to do this for yourself, put your hand on your chest and put your hand on your back. What is the difference between the bone on the hand and the back? When they trample, what remains from the body of Imam Hussein? Aslan, what remained? Could you call it the body of Imam Hussein? You know, why did they do this? Their goal was to eliminate any trace of Imam al-Hussein, including any trace of the body of Imam al-Hussein. Which is why when the enemy went to Ibn Ziyad and he said, what did you do with the body? He said, Tahnaha tahnan. We grounded it. And you've mixed it with the sand. There is no trace of Imam al-Hussein. This is what they went to do. Why? Eliminate any trace of Hussein, including any trace from the body of Hussein. They were there to eliminate the name of Imam al-Hussein. In this environment, Imam Sajjad established the foundations of Azadan. You trampled on the body of Imam al-Hussein. You tried to eliminate traces of the body. The body is the body. But this name Hussein, we will keep it alive. One of our teachers in the house used to say, the name of Hussein, just this name Hussein, has a Qudsiyya, has a level of divinity attached to it, greater than what man can comprehend. They tried to eliminate the trace of the body, leave the body. They couldn't eliminate the name Hussein.
حسينيات حسينيات يزيديات نارا هادري صلوات على محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Dhikr of Imam al-Hussein, the name Hussein, the Azaa of Hussein alayhi salam. Imam Sajjad set this foundation. And from this foundation, one of the things Imam Sajjad did, the historians mention that the women of Bani Hashim would hold a ma'tam. And from here comes the role of the women of Bani Hashim. I don't want to touch on this for tonight, and inshallah we will speak on it in the nights to come. Bi'awnillah. What type of azaa and what type of majlis azaa the women of Bani Hashim had, and the role of Sayyidah al-Baneen in this, alayha salam, ruhila al-fidah. But as the women would eulogize and weep for Imam al-Hussein, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam would cook the food in the ma'atam. Ma'asum Imam, Hujjatullah fil ardh, whose nur emanates through the arsh and over, cooks in the ma'atam of Imam al-Hussein. In this there are lessons, and in this there are ahkam fiqhiyya as well. We have tons of ishkal that are raised in centers, in bargas, in majlises, in the walk towards Arba'in. And all these so-called intellectuals come forward and they say, look at this money that you spend in the cooking food in the majlis of Imam al-Hussein. The people can afford their own food. These are not people who are poor. People all eat their dinners they can afford. Why do you spend this food in the majlis of Imam? Why do you spend this money cooking food in the majlis of Imam al-Hussein? Baba, take this money, go and donate it in a hospital, give it in charity. This is money that is more used. This in itself is a form of jahl. To ask is not wrong, but to criticize institutions that cook in the name of Imam al-Hussein, to criticize is jahl. To ask is from ilm. To criticize is jahl. See, there is a fiqh of hadith when Imam Sajjad alayhi salam used to cook in the ma'tam of the women of Bani Hashim. Person has to sit back and ask, who are the women that were attending the majlis? Were they women who could afford their own food? And there were women who could not afford their food. Did the Imam distinguish between any one of them? No. He fed those that could afford and those that could not afford. And over here, there is a big lesson that comes forward. That the reasoning and the philosophy behind the cooking in the name of Imam al-Hussein is something far greater than providing sustenance that to those that cannot afford. The qadiyya is much greater. It's about nourishing flesh and blood with food cooked with this name Hussein. Because your flesh and your blood will give rise to bodies that are Husseini from the core. The food that you eat has an effect on your soul. Imam al-Hussein said this to the people. Why these mu'ajizat? Why my guidance doesn't have any effect on you? لَقَدْ مُلِئَتْ بُطُونَكُمْ بِالْحَرَامِ. Islam has said, do not consume food except that it is halal. Yani food upon which Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim has been recited with the other shurut of dhabiha. But one of them is what? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Correct? Then what about food that is cooked on the name of the one who saved Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim? They say food that you eat which is not halal takes you away from Allah. What about food that is cooked in the name of Hussein alayhi salam, Imam al-Hussein? It has an athar on the nafs. The food that you consume has an impact on your salat, has an impact on your soul, has an impact on your generation that comes after you. This food that is cooked in the name of Imam al-Hussein has shafa'ah in it. This name Hussein is powerful beyond understanding. And there's much more in this. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam put forward the sunnah. Enter you come to weep and give condolences over the tragedy of my father. My father was killed hungry and thirsty. I will ensure the ones who come to weep for my father don't go home hungry and thirsty. Qadiyya, the issue is much greater than sustenance and charity. It has a janib ruhi. There is much to say on just what Imam Sajjad did when Hujjatullah fil Ard cooks. It's supposed to symbolize something alim. And he cooked in the majalis of the women. If you look at another bu'ud, another janib of analysis, this was a form of encouragement for the women, particular to attend Majlis Azhar. Why? See, when the Masum Imam cooks the food that is distributed in the Ma'tam, what does this mean? It is a token of approval for such gatherings to happen. At the very minimum, it's approval. Sahih? Why did Imam al-Hussein? At the minimum, it is approval. At another level, it is what? It is encouragement. Why did the Imam encourage the women to gather in Ma'tam? He set forward the precedent for the women to take a particular lead role in upholding and passing on the azadari of Imam al-Hussein from generation to generation, because it is these women, if azar and being a Husseini and the sha'air of Imam al-Hussein is established in the hearts and the souls and the blood of the women, they will pass it on to their children in the next generation. Women who are Husseini give birth to children who are Husseini. And they saw this as a responsibility. They saw this as a responsibility. The woman says, I will cry for Imam al-Hussein how long? As long as I'm alive. 30 years, 40 years, 50, 60, 90 years. So, Ya Fatima al-Zahra, I don't want the tears for Imam al-Hussein to be restricted to my life only. So I will invest my life and my time in tarbiyah for children after me who will continue your tears. Shayun Azim that Imam Sajjad alayhi salam put forward. And Fi'lan, you look at this silsila, generation after generation of people who have come and have exhibited junoon in the way of Imam al-Hussein. Their mothers had a role in this. And they had a role that was great. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam established the fundamentals and the foundation of upholding Azhar. So now start to put everything into context. He lives in an environment where there are not even 20 people who love or show sympathy towards Ahlul Bayt. In that surrounding, Imam Sajjad said, not only the men, the women start weeping for Imam al-Hussein. Before we go into Masa'ib, the last point for Azhar. And there is much to say in this, what Imam Sajjad did in establishing this institution of Azhar. Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam made it such that he would go into the public squares, into the market, and make aspects of everyday life an indicator to the madhlumiyat of Imam al-Hussein. Such that the historians mention, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam one time was walking in the market. And as he was walking in the market, he passed by the section of the butchers. And he sees one of the butchers getting ready to slaughter the sheep. But this is Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam. He goes and in the middle of the market, he calls out to the butcher and he says to him, oh man, in front of everyone. They stop. They turn towards him. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam looks at him and he says, oh man, did you feed this sheep? Did you let it drink water? Ajib. The butcher looks at him and says, Ya Ibn Rasulallah, how can you even ask us this question? We are people who are Muslims. We don't slaughter except that. We quench the thirst of the animals before. Imam Sajjad would use this. He would sit in the middle of the market amongst the butchers. He would cry out, Wa Husayna, Wa Madhluma. He says the sheep are made, their thirst is quenched before they are slaughtered. But here the grandson of Rasulullah, the grandson of Rasulullah was slaughtered while he was thirsty by the banks of the Furat. I don't want to recite this Masa'ib because this is khas to the Maqtal of Imam al-Hussein Yawm Ashura. But Imam Sajjad uses the word slaughter for his father Abu Abdullah. Allah, Allah. The historians mention, Ya Shaykh Mohamed, The historians mention that the oppressors of Bani Umayyah poisoned Imam Sajjad on the nights like these. And the 25th night of Shahr Muharram, Walid ibn Abd al-Malik al-La'in had poisoned Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam because they saw him to be a threat to their empire in Medina. And this was the final night of Imam Sajjad. The historians mention that the impact of the poison on Imam Sajjad was such that his entire intestines and his stomach and chest felt like it was on fire, burning up from the inside. Allah. You know, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam was the first Imam from Ali Muhammad who was given a public funeral. No other Imam before him was given a public funeral. But Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam describes the ghusl, that how he gave ghusl to Imam Sajjad. Upon his martyrdom, Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam says, I gave the ghusl and I gave the coffin to my father. Imam al-Baqir, Ruhi lahul fida, Abu Ja'far, was seated in the side of the house and he was seen weeping and crying uncontrollably. They asked him, Ya Abu Ja'far, why is it that you weep and you cry? He says, it is what I saw from when I gave the ghusl to my father, Zainul Abidin. Allah, Allah, all the bruises and all the scars and all the injuries that were on the body of my father. They said to him, Ya Abu Ja'far, Ya Ibn Rasulullah, explain to us, tell us of the injuries on the body of your father. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, Imam al-Baqir says he had bruises on the middle of his back. He said, where did these bruises come from? He said, the first type of bruises on the back of my father was from the heavy sacks of rice and grain that he would carry on his back while he was distributing food to the less fortunate people in Medina. Remember this. Imam Sajjad says, I lived in a place where not 20 people loved me. He would distribute food to those who hated him, to those who abused him, to the extent that he had bruises on his back from the weight of the food that he distributed. Imam al-Baqir says, the first type of bruising on the back of my father was from the weight of the food that he would carry to distribute. They said, what other bruises were there? It says the other type of the bruises were from the whips that were given to him by Omar ibn Sa'ad and Shimar and Khuli for the time they were taken prisoners from Karbala to Kufa and Kufa to Shah. Ya Shia Ali Mohamed, those of you who do the Sajjils, those of you who do the Sajjils, you know how the scars lay on the backs. What type of, with what intensity would have Imam Sajjad been whipped such that 40 years later there was still bruising and scarring on the back of Imam Zainul Abidin? The narrations mention that Imam Sajjad was so weak. He was so weak. The historians mention that every time him or the women were slow in walking, Shimar al-Lain would come and would whip Imam Sajjad on the back. Imam al-Baqir says there were whip marks and the bruises of the whips on my father's back, Imam Sajjad. But what other marks were there on the body? Imam al-Baqir says that there were scars on the wrists and on the ankles of my father. He says, where did these marks come from? Where did the scars come from? Imam al-Baqir says, when they tied the hands and they tied the feet of my father's Zainul Abidin as a prisoner. They tied the rope so hard around the ankle. The sisal cut through the skin on the wrist and it cut through the skin on the ankle such that Imam Sajjad was bleeding. How must they have tied these sisal ropes such that 40 years the marks are still on his body? Allah, Allah. It says, Yabna Rasulullah, was there any other bruise and any other scar on the body of your father? Imam al-Bakir says, there were scars around the neck of my father, Imam Zainul Abidin. He says, why around the neck? He says, because when he was taken as a prisoner, they put a jami'ah around the neck of my father. Do you know what is a jami'ah? Jami'ah is an iron collar. It was put around the neck of Imam Sajjad with nails that were protruding, nails that would pierce the neck of Zainul Abidin alayhi salam. Imam Sajjad says the nails were such that if I turned my neck to the right or I turned my neck to the left, they pierced my neck, which is why when they removed the Jami'ah in the prison, when they removed the Jami'ah in the Darbar, it says blood began gushing out from the neck of Zainul Abidin. Allah, Allah, I say over here, this musibah reminds me of the Masaib of Zahra. Over here, there are nails that were protruding that pierced your neck. Ya Zainul Abidin, there was a nail that punctured the lung of your mother, Fatima. Allah, Allah, Ya Shahadah Mohamed. I don't know how Imam al-Bakir gave ghusl to Imam Sajjad, but when the ghusl was given to him, these are the final moments. This Imam al-Bakir narrates how he gave ghusl to Imam Sajjad. Before he gave the ghusl, and this is the final part of my masah. Imam al-Bakir narrates that on the final moments before my father took his final breath, I was lying down on his chest. I had my head on his chest. My father would gain consciousness. My father would lose consciousness because of the intensity of the poison. At one of the times he gained consciousness, he then appointed me and made me the Imam and the Khalifa and the Hujjatullah on the people after him. He gave me the Dhul Fiqar, he gave me the Jami', he gave me the Mus'haf Fatima. He then bestowed upon me the Ismul A'adam. And then he says, my father fainted. He says, as my father fainted, Imam al-Bakir says, I put my head on the chest of my father. When my father gained consciousness, these were his final moments. I saw my father began to weep and cry. I said to him, oh my father, why is it that you cry at these moments? You are now going to be united with your father and your grandfather. Imam Zainul Abidin said, oh my son Mohamed, on my final moments, you were on my chest. But I remembered who was on the chest of my father, Abu Abdullah in Karbala. Oh my son Mohamed in Karbala. Shimar was on the chest of my father, Hussein. And it is as if I can see him. He kicked my father. He kicked him out of Hussein. Sayyida Zainab coming running from the Khaymaga shouting out, Ya Adu Allah. Matam Sajjad, Matam Zainab, Matam Hussein.